All right, so today we're going to be continuing with chapter 36, and we're going to be, finishing up pretty much the 1950s. So we'll start with President Eisenhower. He did serve 2 terms, so he does have a full 8 years to sort of cover. We can start by talking about his domestic policy. We've already sort of touched on a couple of things like the integration at Central High School. He's very much a president who wants to enforce the law, whatever the law may be. Not necessarily that he was a supporter of civil rights. He just felt like it was his job as president to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling and actually integrate the schools with all deliberate speed. So there are definitely a couple of other domestic policy things that you should know when you think of President Eisenhower. Probably one of the biggest is the Interstate Highway Act, or I guess the Federal Highway Act. If you've ever been even driving down Interstate 40, going to the beach or wherever, there's usually a sign on the side of the interstate that's like a little blue square, and it has like stars in a circle, and in the middle it says Eisenhower Interstate System or Eisenhower Highway System or something. And this is exactly what it is. So it's actually a plan, like $27 billion plan to construct new roads and highways all over the United States. And this was for several reasons. They're going to build 42,000 miles of road. And one, we know that more Americans are moving to the suburbs. We're going to see more travel from location to location. So having these major highways and interstates will certainly make that easier. But actually, another reason was kind of like Cold War related, actually. A lot of these roads, like I said, I-40 is one of them. A lot of these roads are going to be constructed to make it easier for military mobilization. If there was a war to break out or the Soviets try to invade or something like that, we wanted our roads to easily connect our military bases and important military locations, and we need the roads to be wide enough for a military, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, but I guess a caravan to be able to go down with tanks and jeeps and all sorts of other stuff. So that's really the main reason why a lot of these roads were built, but thousands and thousands of miles of roads that we have and use today as part of our regular highway system were all constructed under this plan. So it's going to have, a lot of long-term bonuses for everyone. The other major domestic policy that you should note of Eisenhower's is actually called Operation Wetback. You probably hear that term and you think like, oh, that's racist. That's a racist term for Mexican families or people. And yes, you're right. That is exactly what it is, and that's pretty much exactly what the term in the operation title meant for it to be. It was targeting Mexican immigrants. So if you remember, during World War II, we began the Bracero program, which was to purposefully bring Mexican migrants to the United States to use them for farm labor, and they were treated very horribly. Well, we haven't ended that program, even though the war's over. We were still using them for farm labor because not as many white Americans were getting jobs as farm labor, or really any other Americans for that matter. So the federal government was worried that illegal immigration would cut down on the amount of people they were able to recruit for the Bracero program, and that they wouldn't be able to control the farm labor if everyone was just like coming in however they wanted. So Operation Wetback was purposefully designed to target people who were undocumented migrants coming into the or immigrants coming into the United States to work. And through this operation, they're going to arrest and deport like over 1 million workers in an effort to support that Bracero program, which we know was already not a good program because those employees and farm laborers are going to be treated really horribly. And so this is definitely something that Eisenhower is going to continue for. a fair portion of his presidency. As far as Eisenhower's foreign policy goes, we're sticking with Cold War issues. We're sticking with containment. But there are definitely a few other things that Eisenhower wanted to or add to that. Now, Eisenhower is definitely facing a different era of the Cold War than presidents previous, and that's because of the death of Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin died, and a new leader took hold of the Soviet Union, and his name was Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev is spelled Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev was very different from Stalin. He actually was pretty critical of Stalin and his strategies, and especially his more violent tactics. Khrushchev was certainly a true believer when it comes to communism. He wasn't quite as aggressive or violent as of a leader as Joseph Stalin was. So it definitely marked a new period, and a lot of people had questions, like, where does this leave the Soviet Union? Where does this leave the Russian people? What about Russian Soviet states in Eastern Europe? What about their relationship with the US? Like, what does this mean moving forward? And we, out of fear, are going to develop a few other foreign policy strategies to go along with our overall containment doctrine. One is called brinkmanship. Brinkmanship. If you say you're on the brink of something, that means you're on the edge. And so the idea behind brinkmanship is to, put out this vibe, like we're always ready to go to war, massive retaliation. If you, do anything to cross us, we will come back 1,000 times, and we'll be happy to go to war with you. And I guess it's kind of like, like we're trying to seem like we're so unstable and crazy that like hopefully no one will want to mess with us. And by no one, we're obviously thinking of the Soviet Union here. So when Khrushchev came to power, Eisenhower actually met with him in Switzerland. They met face to face at basically like a summit to talk about how our relationship as to the two superpowers of the world is going to operate moving forward with their new leader. And meeting face to face like this was a big step in a positive direction. And, it wasn't just the United States that was fearful of the Soviet Union. They had all of these other, like I said, satellite states, Hungary, Poland, the Ukraine, Romania, who were extremely fearful of Soviet rule and had been severely abused by the Soviet government really since the war was over in 1945, if not before, when they were, quote unquote, liberated from the Nazis. And seeing, Khrushchev meet with Eisenhower was kind of inspirational for them, and it seemed like that they might be able to gain some of their own power back, and that this might be the dawn of a new day for them as well. So during this meeting, some revolutionaries thought maybe this is a good time for us to ask for, some agency. And Poland was one of those countries. A group of Polish workers basically started staging some protests during that meeting, those summits, and Khrushchev actually gave in. He agreed to give the Polish people some power in their own government, and the protests were successful. And that really sent a shockwave through the international community, and it gave even more of a reason to other Soviet satellite and puppet governments, like maybe we can try. So there ended up being a huge uprising in Hungary, primarily student-led, trying to get basically the same thing Poland wanted, but they want more independence. They want to be able to control their own government. They want a pullback or an end to Soviet rule over their country. And unfortunately, at that point, I guess Khrushchev had sort of been pushed too far in his mind, and instead of giving in to the Hungarians the way he had the Poles, he sends troops in and they murder hundreds of Hungarians in the streets. When I was in Budapest a few years ago, they had this massive memorial to those killed in the Hungarian uprising right outside of the Parliament building, which is really moving. It's like a big wall with all of these bullet holes in it, with outlines of people's bodies around the bullet holes and stuff. It's really intense, and it was definitely a low point, and it's definitely setting the precedent that, like, yes, this is a new era. It's not going to be the same as Stalin, but don't get it twisted. This is still the Soviet Union, and you don't get to act however you want. So hope, but not quite as much as a lot of people had been hoping for. Now, the whole world knows that there's this sort of like, chicken fight going on between the United States and the Soviet Union to see like who's going to have the most power and allies. And some countries decide to use that to their own advantage. Egypt is going to be one of them, and we'll have a situation happen in around 1956 called the Suez Crisis. Now, the president of Egypt was a guy named Nasser, Nasser, President Nasser, and he wanted to build a dam along the Nile River in the Suez. And we obviously built the Hoover Dam. We're like, we were really good at building dams. Let us come build your dam. And so we basically give him a quote for it. Now, why do we want to build the dam so bad? Well, because we don't really have much of a presence in the Middle East or Africa. So being able to connect with Egypt would be a great opportunity for us to spread capitalism and to prevent communism from expanding. What we don't want is for the Soviet Union to offer to build their dam, right? Because we don't want that connection to exist. So we give them their quote. They're like, "Thank you so much. We'll think about it." And they took that quote to the Soviet Union and were basically like, "Can you beat it? Can you do it for less?" And this pissed us off. We did not like being pitted against each other for Egypt's financial benefit. If you're Egypt, it definitely makes sense. But as far as Great Britain, France, and the U.S. go, we were very unhappy. So we pull our offer. We basically say, you know what, build your own dam. We're not building any dams today. Y'all are gonna have to work that out on your own. We don't like how you went about it. So pass. And this really pissed off President Nasser. He didn't like that. So he decided to nationalize Egyptian oil fields. And so by nationalize, I mean like place them under, I guess, state control and ownership. So now nobody can buy oil from Egypt unless it's approved by the Egyptian government, because they basically like own all of the land in which the drilling is taking place on. And this is not good for us or Great Britain or France, because we definitely rely on them for our oil supply, and having that jeopardized and potentially cut off could really do damage to our economy. So without consulting the United States, Great Britain and France decide to come up with their own plan on how they are going to get control of this Suez on their own. And so basically what they do is they contact our one and only ally in the Middle East, Israel, which has only even existed as a country since the late 1940s. So very new and young. And on top of that, if you don't know much about biblical history, Israel's relationship with Egypt, not a good one. This is, the beef that goes back to Moses and Ramses II, right? This is a beef older than Jesus himself. No love lost, really, between Egypt and Israel. And that's going to go on for quite some time. They're not friends today. And so they purposefully contact Israel and say, why don't you invade this area of land that is disputed between these two, between your two nations. And if war breaks out, us and the United States will come to defend you, basically in an effort to purposefully take possession of those oil fields, because France had previously had control over them from, African colonization. So Israel does it. They send troops in, and when it looks like a war is about to now begin between Egypt and Israel, everyone's looking at the U.S. like, okay, all right, come on, here we go, get in here. And we're like, what? We did not agree to this. We didn't, no one asked us if we were okay with this. No one consulted us at all. Aren't we supposed to be the leader of the free world? Aren't we supposed to be the, superpower here? And y'all are just like making your own plans and expecting us to fall in line. Eisenhower was not happy about this. So he actually refuses to send troops in, and actually put some sanctions on our allies out of anger. And luckily, the whole thing was able to pull back. The Israelis pulled out of Egypt. Great Britain and France apologized, but this is definitely now opening up these countries like in the Middle East and Africa to realize like that they're not immune from this chicken fight between us and the Soviet Union. Like this can have direct repercussions on them as well. Had a war broken out between Egypt and Israel, it wouldn't have affected the Soviet Union or the United States in terms of lives lost, but it would have affected the people that live there. But really, the fight wasn't between Egypt and Israel this time. It would really have been between us and the Soviet Union and control over the world's finances and this particular oil supply. So out of what they felt like was, a necessity to protect themselves, in 1960, a group of countries will come together to form an organization called OPEC, OPEC, which stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This is an organization that exists to this day, and these 5 countries that form OPEC control almost 100% of the world's oil supply. They control a significant portion of the world's oil supply, and you can probably guess what countries it is. The original 5 founding countries are Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Venezuela. Those countries control a massive portion of the world's oil supply. And pretty soon, other countries with large petroleum exporting ability will begin to join as well. They're not going to have the controlling votes that maybe those original 5 have, but they're definitely going to feel like they need to defend themselves. These other countries feel like they're in jeopardy, and potentially, U.S. or USSR control could happen of their land if they don't figure out how to defend themselves. So that's why they form OPEC. Now, in the late 60s, not in the late 60s, in the late 50s, the next sort of scary moment for us in terms of our foreign policy is going to come when in 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launches a satellite into space called the Sputnik 1, Sputnik, the Sputnik. And this freaked us out. At first, when it launched, we thought it was a nuclear missile coming to kill us all. But when it didn't land, we realized something was up. And it was actually in space. And we were not prepared for that. And we're not about to be beaten to space. Come on now. We're supposed to be on the cutting edge of everything. The Soviet Union can't win space. So this will mark the beginning of the space race. Shortly after, NASA will send in, or not NASA, but the Soviet Union will send into space Sputnik 2, which actually had a living being on board, a dog, to prove that a living entity could survive the trip to space. So they're really making a lot of progress really quickly. So to play catch up here, Eisenhower is going to sign 2 things into law. The first is the National Defense Education Act, so that we can it's basically like several $billion into science and STEM education for U.S. schools, because we want to raise a generation that's going to beat the Soviets in the space race. We want to make sure that our kids are learning all they can about science and technology. The second thing he's going to sign into law is a bill to create the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. And so NASA will begin their own efforts to continue to bring the U.S. into this competitive area with the Soviet Union and, launch this space race into business. Now, one president who's going to take the space race very seriously is going to get elected here in this new term. Eisenhower has served his 2, time for a new election of 1960, and this is going to be a very important important election for a lot of reasons. There are a lot of firsts that come with the election of 1960. It's the first election both Hawaii and Alaska can vote in. It's the first election where both candidates are what's the word I'm looking for? Both candidates were born in the 20th century, which lets you know how old all of our most previous candidates had been. But this is definitely an important election for a lot of reasons. This is also going to be the first election where it's playing out in a news cycle, a televised news cycle. Television by 1960 is pretty much in every American home. So let's sort of compare and contrast our candidates here. The Republicans are going to nominate their vice president, Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon. If you didn't know, Richard Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president. Now you do. And Nixon had, served in the military, had served in the war. He was a veteran. He had served in Congress. He was born poor, worked his way up in life, very much a self-made man, wanted to be a man of the people, all that jazz. On the other hand, we have John Kennedy, also served in Congress, also, had a background as a veteran. He, on the other hand, though, came from a very wealthy background. The Kennedys are, as close as you can get to like royalty in the United States, very much a dynasty of political power, especially in the New England area where they come from. A lot of political power in the Kennedy family and a lot of wealth. Kennedy was raised going to all the best schools, very much like, silver spoon in his mouth type of upbringing. So a lot of differences and a lot of similarities between these two, and the Democrats will nominate John Kennedy for that seat. A lot of people acted like it was going to be a Kennedy in 1960, no matter what. The question for the last 30 years or so was just which Kennedy will it be. John had other brothers who a lot of people anticipated would run. His older brother was really expected, but he was killed in the war. And so that political career sort of died out. Those dreams died out for his family. And so John runs in 1960, and his brother Bobby will run in 1968. But he was also assassinated during that campaign. Bobby Kennedy was. So major issues during this election, obviously communism is one of the biggest. Keeping the economy rolling is going to be another big one. So pretty standard stuff we've been talking about as major issues throughout the 1960s. And through a good portion of this election, things are pretty neck and neck. But this will be the first time that we televise debates. Is going to be 1960. The debates between Kennedy and Nixon were on television, so every American can watch them. And that's going to have a significant impact in how this plays out. Americans who listened to the debates on the radio got a very different perception of who the better candidate was compared to Americans who watched it on television. And that's because, of body language. Picture's worth 1,000 words, and a moving picture probably triple that. So being able to see their presence and demeanor on TV meant a lot. And in these debates, a lot of the time, some people might felt that Nixon had stronger answers because he had more experience in the executive department, but Kennedy appeared more relaxed, more sure of himself, more confident. He was more handsome. He was younger. He seemed stronger. So he definitely had an advantage in that televised debate area. So when it actually came down to it, he'll be successful, and Kennedy's going to pull out the win. Now, one thing I do want to mention before we close out the 1950s here is several new art and literature movements that are important to note. As far as art goes, we're going to see several new artists coming into the mainstream who wouldn't necessarily have been popular before. A lot of these artists, we'll see plenty of artists, sort of falling in line with the traditions of the 1950s and all of those, conservative, I guess, and Christian beliefs. and we'll see plenty of art and literature that reflects that, but we'll also see plenty of art and literature that critiques it, or pushes against it. Jackson Pollock is probably one of the most famous artists of the 1950s, known for abstract expressionism. That painting right there, the splatter, that is Jackson Pollock, and that's his method. He just splattered paint. It was all intentional. You can watch videos of him painting, and he was very purposeful with where the splatter went. Sometimes his own spit or blood was mixed into it. So it's pretty easy to know a Pollock when you see one. And if you don't know, science can test it now, and be sure that it is his. But today, his paintings are worth millions of dollars. And he was, like I said, an extremely famous painter in the late 50s, and his career will continue into the 1960s. As far as literature goes, we're definitely going to see plenty of those beatnik authors criticizing the culture and the issues of the 1950s. Books like Catch-22, which was about World War II, Pilot, or The Crucible, which we've already talked about, which is sort of like the best example of this critique of American society and culture in the 1950s, which you know all about, by Arthur Miller. But we're also going to see other literature movements, like what we would call the Southern Renaissance, a big wave of new Southern authors writing about Southern politics and culture. One of those books is called All the King's Men, which is about a corrupt politician in the South in the 1950s. Really good book and really good movie if you haven't seen it. And as far as architecture goes, we're going to see big growth of architecture in an area that we would call the international style. You see these buildings on the far right? That is the international style. They look very basic, and like boxy, a lot of like metal and chrome. That's pretty much like the main I guess you would say, like, highlighted parts of the international style. And so the New York's headquarters for the UN is going to be built in this exact style. And we'll start to see more buildings, not just in New York, but in DC and other major cities, Chicago, Boston, will start to all look very similar.